In this presentation, I want to talk about two heritage sites that have had a very interesting history, because at one stage, both of them, they are incidentally on the same piece of ground. In fact, they're virtually one on top of the other, but they are more than 1,000 years apart in their origins. So that's the first remarkable thing about them, that two such places should exist at all. The second remarkable thing is that they there was a lot of press publicity and media hype and so on at the time of their discovery, and then they kind of fell off the bandwagon and nobody heard about them for 50 years, and then eventually we have resuscitated them again. So they've had a very bumpy ride in the course of their recognition as heritage sites, and they're both very important heritage sites indeed. They are sited on a property that is now known as ToppiesHoek, and that has got nothing to do with old men in a corner. As far as I can establish, the reason why it's called ToppiesHoek is a kind of anglicized corruption, because they're on the high ground of a farm that was expropriated for Hartbeespoort Dam, which was completed in 1923, just 101 years ago. The bit of the farm that wasn't flooded, in other words, the high ground or the top corner, remained dry, and it's this piece of ground in the foreground of this picture, and that is the origin of the word ToppiesHoek, and it's a fairly recent name. It used not to be called that at all. It now belongs to Tshwane University. It's gone through a loop of owners over the last 50 years, and it now belongs to Tshwane University of Technology. And they use it as a venue for student outdoor activities, and they do leadership schools and stuff like that for their students there. And the university authorities, knew nothing at all about this site. It was known to a few people who are interested in this kind of thing, like Mike and myself and other people around that area, but the two sites had become forgotten altogether. One of them is an early Iron Age site. It is actually the earliest, the first settlement of black South Africans. So it is an extremely important site historically. Whites, we've got Jan van Riebeck as a statue in Cape Town foreshore. There is nothing to say where black people first arrived, and this is the spot. So it is actually a very important site historically, and there's evidence there of farming and metalworking and pottery and so on that these people brought to the region, and which distinguished them, the black population, from the previous inhabitants of this part of the world, who were nomadic hunter-gatherers. The other is the Leiden University's observatory, which they set up virtually on the same site as the Iron Age site, much later, of course, in 1953. And there are two historically important telescopes that they have left behind and that have now become the property of Tshwane University. And that period that they were there, from the 1950s into till about 1978, that, if you remember, those of us who are old enough to remember, was the beginning of the space age. The Russians were putting up Sputnik satellites. The Americans were doing the same a little later. People were landing on the moon. That was the time that we were, as humans, were really exploring space for the first time. And the work that was done at the observatory at ToppiesHoek was extremely valuable in contributing to our knowledge of that. And the story there begins in 1923, incidentally the same time at Hartbeespoort Dam was filled, but nothing to do with that, where Willem de Sitter, who was the director of the Leiden University Observatory, the oldest operating observatory in the world, and also one of the most prestigious, he formed a collaborative agreement with Robert Innes, a remarkable guy who was the director of the Union Observatory. Now, you might think that the arrangement between Leiden and Johannesburg Observatory was really in favor of Johannesburg, because Leiden is much more famous. But in fact, Johannesburg offered the Dutch astronomers an opportunity to look at the southern sky, which of course they couldn't see where they were in Holland. So it was important to them, and a lot of Dutch people came from the Netherlands and used the observatory in Johannesburg, and really benefited greatly from it. The first telescope that they used when they came here was already fairly famous. It was one that had been built by John Franklin Adams way back in 1903, but it's a sort of coffin bolted onto a thing that looks like it's made out of a Meccano set. But in fact, it was state of the art. The thing about this telescope was its lens. It was unique in the early 1900s. It was a wide angle but extremely sharp lens. And that's it in the front of the telescope that you can see there. And it projected the image of the sky onto a 12-inch glass plate at the back. And in the early days, in the early 1900s, photographic emulsions were so slow that it took 2 hours to make an exposure. You had to expose them for 2 hours. But you got an extremely accurate picture. But imagine, in 2 hours the sky moves, or the Earth moves actually, and the sky you have to track as it goes. For 2 hours this camera had to keep itself exactly on the spot that it was following. It was an 8-degree arc of the sky. That's about as big as your hand. If you hold your hand up against the sky, it took a patch of sky about that big, which is quite wide angle for a telescope, but still very, very sharp. And so it produced, or Franklin Adams was able to produce, the first high-definition photographic atlas of the entire world. He took, or the entire sky, southern and northern hemisphere was all photographed on this camera. It took something like 20,000 exposures during its 75-year history, down to a magnitude of 15. Astronomers, are there astronomers in the audience? Good, I can be rude about them. Because they look up, everything's upside down. Their brightest star is measured at the magnitude 1, and then the dimmest star is 2, 3, 4, etc. Magnitude 15 is minutely dim, and you really can't see it very well at all. It was certainly not with the naked eye. But this camera was capable of taking that, so it produced that. Then in 1910, it took, because it had a wide angle, it took the best pictures, recognized the best pictures in the world of Halley's Comet when it visited our solar system in 1910. So that made it very well known indeed. And then its most famous use was the discovery by Robert Innes in 1915 of the closest star to Earth, Proxima Centauri, which is a very dim star, and it's completely swamped by Alpha Centauri, which is much further away than it is, but and so you can't see Proxima Centauri very well. But by comparing two identical pictures taken with this telescope, one in 1910 and the other in 1915, 5 years apart, he could detect, by flicking from one to the other, he could detect this minute movement of light, which demonstrated that there was a star there, and he was able to calculate its distance, and it's relatively close. It's only 4 light years away, which is just around the corner, as it were. Now, the thing that Leyden wanted to do particularly was look at double stars, or binary stars, or pulsating stars. A binary star, 2 stars that actually rotate each other and their gravity holds them together. And what they were doing were looking at spectrographs of these stars, and by looking at the different colors of light that are produced by the star, they can tell which elements the star is made of, and by that they can judge its mass, and by that they can judge its distance from Earth and the velocity of the orbits. And this told them a lot about space. Now remember, we didn't have Hubble telescopes and James Webb telescopes out in space. This was the first really good information was being gathered in the 1920s and 30s about space itself, the universe as it's, and the beginnings of the Big Bang Theory and so on. Now, Leyden was contributing very significantly to that. But that old telescope of Franklin Adams wasn't really good enough, so their deputy director, Anya Hertzsprung, designed this incredible thing. It was paid for by Rockefeller, so it was called the Rockefeller Twin Astrograph. And he designed it in 1929. It took almost a decade to build. It was only delivered in 1939, 9 years later, delivered to Johannesburg. And even then, its lenses weren't quite as good as Hertzsprung had really wanted. So he ordered some more in 1939. He ordered some lenses from Zeiss in Jena in Germany. 1939 was a hell of a bad year to be doing business with Germany. If you remember, that was the beginning of the Second World War. So those lenses weren't delivered until 10 years after that, in 1949. So it had actually taken 20 years for this telescope to be completed. Actually, it did good work with the old lenses, but not as well as Hertzsprung had really hoped for. But when it came, light pollution was a problem in Johannesburg. Johannesburg in 1949-50 was getting really into quite a big city, and so it was a problem. They moved both of those telescopes, the old Frankfurt Adams and the Rockefeller telescope, out to Hartbeespoort Dam, and that is the site that I'm talking about now. That period that I mentioned earlier, from 1953, which is when they moved the telescopes, until 1978 when they left, was, as I mentioned, the height of the beginnings of the space age. And they did extremely important work in that place. During that time, a lot of Dutch astronomers came. One of them was Arno van Genderen. Arno was a PhD graduate from Leiden, and he came out here with his young wife, and he lived for 8 or 9 years in a little cottage next to the telescopes. But he also happened to be an amateur, and quite a good amateur archaeologist. And he walked outside of his door of his cottage, and he saw potsherds all over the place, and strings of ostrich shell beads and all sorts of stuff. Wondered what they are. Nobody could give him an answer. So he went off to see Revel Mason, who was the doyen of archaeology in the Magaliesberg region, in fact in the whole of what was the Transvaal. And this is what Revel said in an article that he wrote a few years later. He said, in April 1973, a slender, dark-haired Hollander knocked on my office door with a brown paper bag. He was an astronomer at the Leiden Observatory near Hartbeespoort Dam. He opened the bag and he poured out a pile of decorated potsherds that he had found near the observatory. Instantly, I recognized the decorations. I knew they were over 1,000 years older than those I had found at Olifantspoort. Olifantspoort is nearer Rustenburg, along the mountains. And it's a late Iron Age site, and we know a lot about that, but these were now at least 1,000 years older. I had only found 1 or 2 in the past, and here he had a whole bag full. So Revel moved out with his team of archaeologists. They excavated the site between 1973 and 1975. Tom Huffman is another Wits archaeologist of renown, followed him in 1999, 2000, roundabout then. And between them, they made these extraordinary discoveries about that site. Both men very sadly died just a couple of years ago, more or less within a year of each other. That is Revel in the middle of the picture talking to the the Archaeological Society, and he covered all the places that he had unearthed with steel to protect them, and that took about a month for people to steal it and go and build houses nearby. But what they had found was this. The people who lived there, 350 AD, just to put that in perspective, in 350 AD, Britain was an outlying, very unimportant colony of the Roman Empire. The Brits were running around in bearskins and painting themselves blue with woad. So that's the period that we're talking about. These guys were building huts. They knew how to do that. They knew how to make pottery, which made a huge difference. They could store and carry liquids, which previous hunter-gatherers could not do. They made grain baskets, which means that they could grow grain. They could husband animals, keep domestic animals, milk them, and use their meat for eating, which made a huge difference, and their skins for clothing. And they could smelt iron. And this is why they're referred to by archaeologists as the Iron Age, the early Iron Age. That enabled them to have hoes and instruments for farming, and so they definitely had agriculture as well. They also had ceremonial burials. Now, in this custom has died out, and that's one of the big differences between the early Iron Age of 1700 years ago and the later Iron Age, which was about 200 years ago. They would bury an important personage, would be buried in a shallow grave until the body had decomposed. They would then exhume the skeleton and put the skull or the bones into a pot, and the pot would stand in the middle of the village ceremonially, and they obviously worshipped their ancestry. Now, before we say how primitive, remember that a lot of people today cremate their dead, put their ashes in an urn and keep it on the mantelpiece. So it's not a very dissimilar activity. Then that attracted a good deal of press publicity and media attention, and it was at the height of the apartheid era. So to tell the world and other South Africans that actually black people had been in this country 1,000 years longer than anybody had ever known was big news, and it was very well publicized in Sultan and very well publicized in the Netherlands and Europe as well. But once the fuss was over, the site was left to go wild, and these are archaeologists looking at the site today. It's all overgrown. You can't really see anything much, and the telescopes have just been left there. Leiden moved out in 1978 and went to Chile, leaving 2 telescopes specifically for educational use, but they left them to the CSIR, who didn't actually do anything with it, and nobody has done anything with them for 50 years. They've just been sitting collecting dust. They're not damaged, but they're unusable at the moment, and the mechanisms are old-fashioned. So we saw a huge opportunity here. MACH, the Magaliesburg Association of Culture and Heritage, we entered into a memorandum of understanding with Tshwane University, who now own the land and therefore own the telescopes and the site. We said, okay, we'll do the research and bring in the experts to tell us what is possible. We'll publish a book about this. We'll compile information books, information boards to put up so that visitors can see what's going on and what did go on at these sites. We had a little bit of money in the kitty, and Mach funded those operations, the book and the boards, and we made recommendations to TUT. And they, on their side of the deal, would apply for serious money, which is needed for restoration. They would organize the repair and the restoration of the sites. They'd find educational opportunities, because we were very keen that these should be used, not just admired and people go there and say, oh, wow, but actually used. And this is a technical university, so it's ideal for those students to use these assets, particularly the telescopes, for their own studies. So they would find those educational opportunities, and they have undertaken to re-register the site with SARA. Now, the archaeological site has been registered, first of all, as a national monument in 1980. That was swapped over to SARA with the new government, but SARA has no record of it. Fortunately, we have records of it, so it actually is documented. So we brought out experts. We brought out astronomers and archaeologists. We brought out people that we knew and people that we had heard of to look at the telescopes and the archaeological sites and give us advice. And we also took a lot of advice and guidance from Davie van Jaarsveld at Boyden, just up the road in Bloemfontein. Boyden had a very similar experience. They had Harvard University had an observatory there, and they left their telescope to University of the Free State. And UFS really took the ball and ran with it, and they have turned Boyden into a fantastic facility. That's a picture of their library that they've got there. They had this incredible site that we would aspire to. We hope that ToppiesHoek becomes that. We wrote a little book. I think Mike has got copies of it if you're interested. It tells the full story of what I'm telling now, but in much more detail, and it's a great story. We did 6 information boards, big boards, bigger than a meter big, and put them up on the sites, and they are there for visitors to see, so that the place has got a presence and an understanding and a sense of place that is there. And they explain a little bit about what is going on. We also awarded 3 blue plaques, one each for the 2 telescopes that are there, and one for the archaeological site, and those were put up. And then the real work that we did was a big report that we gave to TUT, which explains the benefits that TUT could get from this. It explains how to protect, what you've got to do, how you can protect the early Iron Age site and the telescopes that we got, of course, from the experts that we had brought, how to use them for educational and research purposes amongst their students, and therefore how to elevate the stature of the Tshwane University. We compiled a comprehensive bibliography of all the literature that has been produced over the years out of the two sites. They've both produced a lot of scholarly work, and when we've compiled a full list of that, we told them about potential collaboration with other universities, WITS, University of Pretoria, and Leiden itself, and we've outlined that. And then we outlined some of the research, the outreach programs to the public or to schools particularly that they could run, like Boyden does. Boyden has kids going in there in busloads, and they really are a serious educational outreach project, which ToppiesHoek could become quite easily. So we submitted this report, and after a while, TUT came on board in a big way, and they're very enthusiastic. And in March this year, they had a big function out there with all sorts of dignitaries from all sorts of the places. The Vice-Chancellor, Professor Malulek, gave a brilliant speech. I really wish that he was here today to address you about the site, because he is very enthusiastic. We unveiled those blue plaques. We had the MEC for Culture and Heritage, I think, from the Northwest Province, and that's my wife in the middle. And we had choirs singing and a big hoo-ha. And then I'll come back to that brown paper bag that Arno van Gendering had and showed Revel Mason 50 years ago. Arno is now a very prominent astronomer. He's still active. He's in his late 80s. And he had been given a copy of a book that I had written long before this project started, in which I talk about these two sites. And his wife gave it to him as a gift, and he said, hey, they're talking about your site. So he contacted me, and we've had a wonderful email correspondence and friendship over the last 2 years. He wrote to me in 2022, and last couple of years we've been corresponding a lot with him and with Jan Willem Pell, who was a colleague of his at the time. And as a result of that correspondence, at the beginning of last year, he sent me the contents of that brown paper bag that he had shown. He had taken it to Holland, but he wanted it brought back to South Africa and repatriated, and he sent it to me, and I've mounted it on this mobile exhibition, which we've used a couple of times now, showing these first artifacts that were the first signs that we had something really very special indeed. So there's kind of a promising end to the story, nearly, because TUT has applied for serious money that I was talking about, enough to restore those telescopes and to do some serious work on the archaeological site. And what we're going to do there, or they are going to do, if they get this funding, which should be announced fairly soon, I hope, hold thumbs, they will be able to restore the telescope. They'll also be able to do non-intrusive excavation of the site. They use nowadays, because there are burial sites there, and that is very sensitive, and one doesn't dig up dead bodies these days lightly, because people that can cause terrible offense. So they're going to use subterranean radar, and they'll be excavating in a non-intrusive manner so that they can see what's underground, and they will map the whole area accurately and see exactly what is what and where is where. And TUT will then have a good boundary of where this site actually is. Alex Antonitis, who's an early Iron Age specialist, is also going to offer and train people at field schools on the site. So it's got a big future, this place indeed. And then to cap it off, the real triumph that I'm able to bring today is that just yesterday morning, as I was driving down from Johannesburg, I got an email from Arno, from Jan Willem Pell, Arno's colleague out there at the time in the 1950s. He's also a professor of archaeology, retired now, to say that Leiden University is going... Leiden University is going to have a big function at South Africa House in Amsterdam about ToppiesHoek on the 7th of November. So I can end this, thank you. So it's a lovely thing to announce at this conference, and to say that at last, after 50 years of dormancy, ToppiesHoek is going to once again be on the international stage, as it should be. So thank you very much for listening. That incidentally is Jan Willem Pell in the bottom right-hand corner. So thanks.